The void itself shivered as if the galaxy had inhaled in terror. Across the yawning black, a corona of molten gold tore through the emptiness, a searing beacon that draped entire star systems in a light so fierce it seemed to burn the edges of perception. Dead worlds, long cold and silent, erupted into spontaneous conflagration, their fractured crusts glowing like the embers of a celestial pyre. Mountains shattered into molten rivers, oceans boiled into vaporous clouds of incandescence, and the very air, thin, poisoned, and long untouched, seared with the touch of divinity. From the furthest reaches of the segmentum obscurus to the shattered remnants of imperial outposts, eyes, both mortal and machine, turned toward the impossible luminescence, the impossible heat, and the impossible authority that had risen without warning. Gothic spires, relics of faith carved over millennia, glimmered under the relentless dawn, their once-proud gargoyles blackened and molten at the tips. Cathedral walls, etched with centuries of prayers, bled shadows that clawed across stone like desperate hands, writhing under the oppressive brightness. Light itself seemed to have weight, pressing down upon the fortified terraces and ageless buttresses, folding around statues of saints and heroes until their forms were distorted, molten, uncanny. Those who gazed upon the spires with human eyes felt a vertigo of awe and terror. The Adeptus Ministorum recorded in trembling hand the sight of solar brilliance consuming the heavens, yet leaving the world curiously intact, a paradox of creation and annihilation, one that made priests weep and astropaths scream. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, trembled under the dual weight of devotion and annihilation. On distant hive worlds, trillions of souls pressed together in ritual fear, chanting prayers that cracked and splintered under the oppressive heat of an unseen sun. Their voices were drowned by the resonance of the void itself, as though the universe had grown sentient and decided to proclaim judgment. The echoes of machinery, the thrum of life support reactors, and the whine of tormented engines all fell into reverent silence, replaced by a singular, unending hum, a tone both musical and malignant, vibrating through the hulls of orbiting battle stations and the cathedrals carved into planetary crust alike. It was the sound of divinity awakening, of authority incarnate, and of something older than the emperor or the golden throne himself. Ships that had once patrolled the void with the quiet precision of the Adeptus Astartes or the Adeptus Titanicus reeled under the radiance. Hulls groaned, plating blistered, and plasma conduits flared and erupted into molten arcs. The void around them rippled, as if reality were water disturbed by a titanic hand. Astropathic networks screamed, broadcasting the impossible sight to distant sectors with static-laden urgency. Words failed, for no tongue or cogitator could describe the singularity of a sun god rising where only darkness had reigned. Even the machine spirit hesitated, its logic looping endlessly in awestruck calculation, uncertain whether to flee, shield, or bow. Below the orbiting worlds, on battle-scarred surfaces, the ranks of the Imperial Guard paused mid-march, lasguns raised in mechanical routine, now trembling in unison with the tremors of their own hearts. The desert sands of desolate planets melted into rivers of molten gold, folding over the remnants of ruined fortresses and shattered landing pads. Prometheum fires flickered in the distance, but were instantly eclipsed by the vast luminance, the light so penetrating it seemed to erase the past, present, and future alike. Even the ice-bound fortresses of the Segmentum Tempestus glistened under the auric onslaught, frost melting into molten cascades that hissed and steamed, carrying with them the faintest whispers of prayers long abandoned. Every soldier, every officer, felt the same gnawing certainty. The galaxy had become a cathedral, and they were its worshippers whether they would it or not. Silent voids echoed with the hum of this sun, a vibration that bent both sound and space. Pulsars blinked and died in sudden awe, comets fragmented into golden mist as they passed through the corona, their ice and rock vaporized instantly into shimmering vapor. Even the stars themselves seemed to flicker in recognition, pale fires dimming before the brilliance of this living sun. Some astropaths reported visions of impossible geometries, of cities wreathed in golden flames, and of chariots made of fire and metal coursing across the heavens. The visions were fragmented, terrifyingly beautiful, and horrifyingly coherent. The cosmos itself had shifted to obey a will both radiant and inexorable. All who perceived it, men, women, xenos, and machine alike, felt the pressing weight of destiny bending around them, an unseen hand shaping everything according to a design older than the emperor. In the courts of distant planetary governors and the command halls of Titan legions, the effect was no less devastating. Strategic calculations melted into irrelevance. Weapons, ships, and even the most disciplined warbands were dwarfed by the incandescence of an eternal dawn. Councils of command faltered in speechless disarray as reports from reconnaissance voidcraft described phenomena that could not exist. Worlds igniting from within without fire, auroras that cut through solid rock, and golden halos so immense that no telescope or auger could fully capture their scale. Each transmission ended in static, as though the light itself consumed comprehension, reducing words and meaning to ash and echoes. And yet in all this cosmic upheaval there was a rhythm, a sense of order beneath the fury. Every flare of gold, every molten river of light, every shadow clawing across cathedral walls was deliberate, purposeful, and inexorably precise. The rising sun did not merely scorch, it illuminated. It did not merely destroy, it revealed. And within that revelation lay a certainty that none could deny. A presence had awakened, one whose dominion stretched beyond mortality, beyond technology, and beyond the Emperor's grasp. The galaxy held its breath, caught in the radiant grip of awe and dread, and in that silence the first whisper of judgment stirred. Warp storms writhed like serpents around the luminous eye, their coils twisting reality into molten fractals that defied comprehension. Space itself seemed to melt under the pressure of incandescent authority, the laws of physics bending as if acknowledging a higher will. Stars blinked uncertainly, some dimming in terror while others flared with renewed fury, their fusion hearts struggling against the aura of divine radiance. The immensity of the phenomenon rendered navigation meaningless. Star charts warped, compasses spun, and the very notion of distance lost all meaning. Every vessel caught in the outer tendrils of the awakening sun found itself trapped in a hellscape of gold and shadow, drifting between annihilation and revelation. Imperial starships, proud instruments of the Emperor's will, fell before the brilliance in a spectacle of uncontrollable collapse. Hull plating blistered and melted, titanic engines shrieked as coolant systems evaporated, and void shields buckled under the weight of pure radiance. Plasma conduits ruptured with sizzling arcs, and containment fields of entire shipboard reactors collapsed into molten rivers of incandescent metal. The Mechanicus, ever devoted to logic and the machine god, recorded these events with trembling devotion, their augurs and servoskulls capturing the impossible spectacle with awestruck precision. The scribes of the cult Mechanicus whispered of a divinity that did not bend to reason, a force that reshaped physics, warped faith, and demanded obedience in equal measure. Through the firestorm of the warp, demonic vessels recoiled. Their baroque, alien geometries writhed in fear as if the light itself burned the warp essence from their twisted forms. Tentacles of energy, molten and alive, tore through their hulls. Psychic whales were swallowed by the unrelenting brightness. Across the void, fleets of Xeno species, Eldar craft, Orc flotillas, and Necron tomb ships alike crashed into the wake of golden devastation, their weapons reduced to molten slag before they could even be deployed. The galaxy, for the first time in millennia, seemed to unify in its astonishment, not by diplomacy or war, but by the sheer magnitude of an incomprehensible god rising among them. On board Imperial vessels, astropaths strained against psychic backlash, their minds assaulted by visions of impossible geometry, searing light, and divine hieroglyphs that burned through thought. Some fell to convulsions, screaming in tongues that had never existed outside of prophecy. Others entered trance-like states, their souls teetering on the precipice of enlightenment or obliteration. In the highest spires of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Magi gazed upon the streams of data pouring from their augur arrays, unable to reconcile the raw power with any principle of cogitation. Even the most disciplined acolytes whispered of miracles and heresies, the distinction between which had been obliterated by the Golden Dawn. Planets beneath the radiance were no less altered. Cities carved from stone and adamantium gleamed as their surfaces absorbed and refracted light in patterns that defied logic, casting fractal shadows that crawled across streets and marketplaces with uncanny intent. On desert worlds, sands boiled into glassy rivers, reflecting the twisted sky above in distorted visions of paradise and ruin. Icebound fortresses cracked and bled molten veins, their frozen ramparts glowing with warmth that defied natural law. Even the flora and fauna of these worlds reacted. Bioforms shimmered and contorted under the unbearable illumination, while psionically attuned creatures screamed, sensing a power beyond their comprehension. Life and death alike bowed to the singular presence, and the boundaries between the two blurred like the edges of molten metal. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in their obsessive record-keeping, labeled the phenomenon as a solar singularity of sentience, a term whispered in awe and fear across their hives. Servitors, clad in rusting plate and bristling with augmetics, toiled ceaselessly to measure and document the unmeasurable. Servoskulls circled above, scanning and recording every photon, every tremor, every pulse of warp resonance. Yet no cogitator, no matter how vast, could calculate the full scope of the divine intrusion. They recorded, observed, and worshipped in equal measure, knowing that the line between discovery and damnation had been erased. Even the most heretical experiments of the Mechanicus paled before this incandescent truth, a being of light, intent, and authority, rising above the galaxy with will unmatched and power unmeasurable. Amid the chaos of collapse and illumination, the ranks of the Imperium's finest, Space Marine strike cruisers, Imperial Navy battle groups, and Titans, struggled to maintain cohesion. Orders became irrelevant as captains and commanders saw the futility of resistance against a brilliance that did not negotiate, reason, or fear. Tactical formations melted into streams of disoriented ships, their weapons exploding spontaneously under the glare. The psychic aura of the sun god overwhelmed targeting systems and astropathic communication alike, and the very fabric of space around each vessel quivered, reshaping trajectories into curves dictated by the divine will. Each crew member faced the stark choice: flee, perish, or worship, though none could truly escape the aura of divinity that now saturated the cosmos. As the storm of light coalesced, the Adeptus Mechanicus began to record incantations and formulas unlike any known to the Imperium. These were not weapon schematics or warp calculations, but symbolic representations of power and awe, runes that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple planes of reality. Some acolytes theorized that the rising sun had become a conduit between the material galaxy and the raw fabric of the warp itself, a living bridge where light became consciousness, and consciousness became omnipotence. The golden eye, now a singularity of purpose and brilliance, did not merely illuminate, it reshaped. Matter, energy, and will itself were remolded into a lattice of divine architecture, observable yet incomprehensible, and entirely irresistible. And within the deepest reaches of the void, where even the emperor's gaze faltered, the first stirrings of understanding emerged. Mortal and immortal alike, human, machine, and xenos, felt the impossible gravity of authority, the inexorable logic of an existence beyond annihilation. Ships that had once engaged in interstellar slaughter now paused, their crews caught in awe-stricken paralysis. In the darkness between stars, the galaxy began to bend, literally and metaphorically, toward the light. It was not conquest, nor judgment, it was revelation. The sun god had risen, and in the molten gold of his presence, the cosmos itself began to kneel. Psychic echoes screamed through the Astronomicon, tearing the minds of astropaths and psychers alike with a resonance older than the Emperor's dominion. Each pulse was at once a hymn and a warning, a vibration of unimaginable authority that rattled the skulls of mortals and the servocraniums of servitors alike. The light of the rising sun did not merely shine, it sang, in frequencies beyond comprehension, weaving a tapestry of power that seared thought and memory alike. Within the warp, currents of psychic energy twisted violently, forming spiraling cyclones of raw potential, fracturing preconceptions and opening fissures in reality itself. Space-time bent in recognition, stretching around the golden radiance, and every being attuned to the immaterial, whether loyalist, heretic, or Xeno's interloper, felt the sudden, unassailable weight of divine scrutiny. Battle brothers shielded their eyes behind helm visors, their power armor trembling under the heat and light that seemed to reach beyond the veil of the void. Titans, ancient war machines enshrined in holy rites, groaned as their plating blistered, their ceramides scorched by a fire that was both real and metaphysical. Flaming wings, immense and impossible, spread across the sky, eclipsing dreadnought titans in a spectacle that was simultaneously celestial and apocalyptic. Each wingbeat sent shockwaves rippling through planetary crusts, collapsing fortresses and vaults with a resonant hum that penetrated even the most fortified bunkers. The soldiers below felt the reverberation in their bones, a physical manifestation of authority that no weapon could counter and no strategy could withstand. The air itself quivered under the weight of celestial power, thickening with heat and charged particles, vibrating with a resonance that disrupted even the most stable atmospheres. On hive worlds, streets of twisted stone and metal buckled beneath the psychic tremors, sending panicked masses scurrying for shelter that would not protect them. Markets, temples, and imperial archives alike shivered and cracked, the architecture bending under a light that defied both engineering and faith. It was as though the cosmos itself had become sentient, responding to a single signal of intent, and every element, living or inert, was drawn into alignment with the divine presence. Even the most hardened commissars who had faced Xeno's horrors, heretic uprisings, and demon incursions, felt a terror deeper than anything their souls had known, a recognition of power absolute, immutable, and beyond challenge. Astropaths broadcasting from orbiting void stations screamed into the warp as their psychic signals collided with the overwhelming aura of the sun god. The Astronomicon, the guiding beacon of the Imperium, shuddered and warped in its normally steadfast brilliance, splintering into spectral radiance that fractured communication across light years. Some psychers fell into trance, eyes rolling back as visions of golden cities, rivers of molten metal, and flaming chariots burned across their minds. Others howled in desperation as their spirits were drawn toward impossible geometries, toward a light that consumed yet enlightened simultaneously. Every mind attuned to the warp, even the most disciplined, now stood on the knife edge between revelation and obliteration. Those who survived would never again perceive the universe as before. Those who did not became whispers of warning, echoes in the warp that trembled with awe and fear. High above, in the orbit of shattered gas giants, the most revered and feared titans of the Imperium braced against the onslaught. Their weapons, once tools of calculated war, now sparked uselessly against the searing aura, as though reality itself denied the efficacy of mortal invention. Servo-arms writhed in defensive calculation, but every motion was dwarfed by the weight of a presence that ignored mass, energy, and will. As the light touched the Titan's armor, inscriptions of devotion blazed with a new, radiant authority, etching themselves into ceramite in patterns unknown to any artificer. Weapon systems flared, magnetically sealed compartments ruptured, and reactors struggled to contain energy that no human or machine had previously conceived. Even the mightiest of the Emperor's war engines were humbled, transformed into instruments of witness rather than instruments of destruction. Below the orbiting fleets, planetary surfaces reflected the horrors of ascension. Cities, fortresses, and shrines became mirrors of the golden radiance, twisting architectural lines into fractal impossibilities that mocked logic. Streets shimmered as if molten, and banners burned with flames that ran in reverse, shadow creeping toward light instead of away from it. Soldiers and psychers alike fell to the ground, eyes wide with awe, their thoughts consumed by visions of impossibility. The air vibrated with psychic resonance, carrying whispers from the light, promises of judgment, glimpses of creation, and a terrifying clarity of order. Some whispered prayers of devotion, others screamed oaths of defiance. None could escape the imposition of authority that radiated from the apex of the golden sun. Even the silent voids beyond the orbiting systems quivered. Xeno's fleets, long accustomed to predation and conquest, halted as their sensors and psychic attunements failed under the magnitude of presence. Eldar seers reported visions of their gods eclipsed, weaving luminous currents in competition with an impossible force. Orc warbands shuddered as their crude navigational instincts faltered, and their grotesque engines ignited prematurely under radiant interference. Necron tomb worlds, ancient and relentless, recoiled at an energy that disrupted stasis fields and sapped their necrodermis with a heat that was not entirely physical. Across the galaxy, life, death, and machine alike were unified in a singular realization. The cosmos itself had been rewritten to accommodate a new and incomprehensible apex of authority. And still, the psychic echoes continued, growing in resonance and complexity. Each pulse of the sun god's awareness rippled across sectors, intertwining with every mind attuned to the warp, binding even the most resistant intellects into a lattice of awe. Those who listened closely heard the pattern of creation itself, an order within chaos that demanded recognition and reverence. Even the Emperor's most loyal agents felt it, a presence neither adversary nor ally, yet infinitely more potent than any power they had known. It was light and judgment, promise and annihilation, brilliance and terror, all condensed into a singularity of unassailable will. The galaxy had no choice but to witness, to comprehend in partial glimpses, and to submit in the shadow of through void gates, erupting in arcs of molten gold that licked the hulls of incoming fleets like the tongues of an angry god. Xeno's vessels, once confident in their speed and cunning, were reduced to molten husks in silent immolation, their exotic alloys boiling into rivers of incandescent metal that drifted across the blackness. The warp itself screamed in protest as reality bent beneath the intensity of the radiance, currents of raw psychic energy tangling with the flaming tendrils of the sun god's power. Even the most distant outposts, designed to withstand orbital bombardment and void storms, trembled under the pressure, their orbital defenses flaring uselessly against a force that did not negotiate nor relent. On icebound fortresses, the transformation was no less profound. Citadels of frozen stone groaned as heat seeped into the core, melting glaciers and raising clouds of steam that reflected the golden aurora above. Banners, once symbols of loyalty and pride, burned in reverse, their flames reaching downward as shadows stretched unnaturally across the fortress's battlements. The soldiers stationed on these frozen worlds gazed skyward, helpless and awestruck, as the sun's gaze turned their homes into molten sanctuaries. Every prayer, whispered oath, and heretical murmuring was consumed, transfigured into light, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang like the final note of a cathedral bell echoing across the void. The golden flares did not discriminate. Imperial Navy battle groups found their strategies unraveling as their own weapons melted into incandescent streaks before they could even reach their targets. The mightiest void shields, designed to withstand orbit-shattering bombardments, buckled under the purity of light. Even the Astartes, clad in ceramite and sacred relics, felt the relentless heat piercing through armor, a divine fire that seared both body and spirit. Chaplains and tech marines alike recorded the phenomenon with grim reverence, their quills and servoskulls capturing patterns of destruction that were at once horrifying and sublime. These were no ordinary weapons of war. They were instruments of revelation, reshaping the galaxy according to an order that defied mortal understanding. On worlds scarred by millennia of conflict, the sun god's influence reshaped landscapes in hours. Cratered plains and shattered cities glowed as molten fissures spread beneath streets and fortresses alike. Rivers of gold wound through valleys, consuming forests and swamps in silent purification. Ancient cathedrals, their spires carved with devotion and fear, reflected the light in fractal patterns, shadows dancing with a life of their own across walls and sanctuaries. Priests fell to their knees, astropaths fell into convulsions, and the citizens of countless worlds looked on, frozen in awe and terror, as the divine conflagration claimed both their fear and their reverence. In orbit above, Titan war engines struggled to maintain cohesion under the assault of searing light and psychic resonance. Their weapons melted in their own barrels, reactors flared with unstable energy, and the machine spirits, usually obedient to their human masters, howled in confusion at the divine presence that treated even the most formidable war engines as fragile toys. Yet the Titans endured, not as instruments of war but as monuments to the human will, bearing witness to a spectacle that dwarfed even their legendary might. Each step they took across planetary surfaces left footprints of molten energy, their colossal forms silhouetted against skies ablaze with golden fire, titanic shadows stretching far beyond comprehension. Xeno's fleets, long accustomed to the predations of the Imperium, faced a threat that transcended their worst nightmares. Eldar ships, vessels of sleek grace and psychic precision, twisted in the gravitational distortions caused by the sun god's rise, their matter bending under the radiant force. Orc warbands, relying on crude speed and crude cunning, found engines and weapons failing catastrophically under a power that refused to obey randomness or chaos. Even the Necron tomb ships, ancient and immortal, experienced systemic failures as their stasis fields collapsed under the weight of radiance, forcing one-sun-feeling constructs into chaotic flight. Across the galaxy, every intelligent being understood a singular truth. This was not war in the conventional sense. This was revelation, purification, and dominion enacted through fire and light. Beneath the sun god's radiance, psychers and astropaths became conduits of celestial energy. The astronomican flickered, warping as the immense light coalesced into psychic currents that pulsed across space. Some psychers saw visions of impossible geometries, of cities and planets wreathed in molten auroras, and of beings of light that moved across the heavens with intent and authority. Others screamed, their minds fracturing under the absolute clarity of divine will. The very warp quivered as if it recognized a power that superseded its dominion, a consciousness that did not need mortals, machine, or matter to assert supremacy. Across the void, psychic resonance and radiance intertwined, forming a lattice of pure authority that bound the galaxy in awestruck obedience. And yet, amid the destruction and revelation, there was a rhythm, a deliberate orchestration to the sun god's actions. Each flare, each molten arc, each collapse of a fleet or fortress was measured, purposeful, and inescapable. It was not chaos, nor merely annihilation. It was illumination and judgment, a demonstration of power so absolute that even the most powerful of mortals and Xenos recognized their insignificance. The galaxy had become both altar and witness, and all who remained could only submit to the incandescent authority that reshaped worlds, fleets, and psyches alike. The rising sun had turned every battlefield into a crucible, every mind into an instrument of comprehension, and every heart into a trembling vessel of awe. From the throne of Terra to forgotten hive worlds at the edge of the segmentum obscurus, mortals and psychers alike fell to a terror that was reverent and absolute. Across thousands of worlds, the golden radiance etched itself into the fabric of existence, an omnipresent light that warped matter, energy, and consciousness with every pulse. Even the most distant spires of the Adeptus Ministorum reflected the sun god's influence, turning holy icons into radiant conduits of divine authority. Priests whispered prayers in fractured tongues, while astropaths quivered under psychic feedback that carried the resonance of creation itself. The light was not merely illumination. It was law, judgment, and revelation, all intertwined in patterns that defied mortal comprehension. Golden runes formed spontaneously on the surface of planets, flowing across stone and metal as though reality itself was a canvas for divine artistry. They pulsed with energy, resonating across entire sectors, and each rune seemed to carry a fragment of knowledge or command that no human mind could fully grasp. Psychers, caught within these patterns, felt their own power magnified and distorted, every thought and vision refracted through a prism of absolute authority. Demons, sensing a force beyond the warp, recoiled violently, their forms disintegrating under the purity of radiance that burned through corruption. Across the galaxy, a single truth became undeniable. The sun god's rise had rewritten the rules of existence, bending life, matter, and the immaterium alike to a golden will. On hive worlds, trillions of souls experienced awe and terror in equal measure. Streets that had been carved from centuries of human toil and labor shimmered as light seared into their foundations, twisting stone and metal into fractal forms. Citizens paused in their endless cycles of toil, their prayers and superstitions rendered insignificant in the face of omnipotence. Even the most devout, who had spent lifetimes seeking communion with the emperor, felt the insufficiency of their faith. Temples flared with golden brilliance, saints and relics glowing as if infused with life, while heretical shrines disintegrated into light, their sin burned clean. Across the hive sprawl, there was a uniformity in response: awe, paralysis, and the instinctual drive to kneel before a power that defied opposition. The Adeptus Mechanicus chronicled the phenomena with frantic devotion. Servoskulls traced runes in the air, augmented cogitators calculated patterns in radiance that were impossible to fully quantify, and data scrolls filled with diagrams that no human eye could read without shattering. Archmagos and tech priests speculated on the implications: an energy source that could stabilize the warp yet also consume it, a sentience capable of reshaping reality at the molecular and psychic level, a divinity that obeyed no known laws of science or faith. They recorded tirelessly, knowing that what they were witnessing could not be replicated, yet fearing the consequences of their observations. It was knowledge as both blessing and curse, illuminating truths that the mind could not fully contain. Demons, the eternal predators of the immaterium, found themselves utterly unprepared. The radiant aurora tore through their essence, unraveling the chaotic forms they had cultivated over eons. Claws and tendrils melted under golden heat, twisted features evaporating into shimmering motes of nothingness. Even the most powerful demon princes recoiled, their pride shattered by a force that exceeded both the warp and mortal conception. Across the stars, a chorus of psychic screams resonated, a symphony of terror that was both warning and elegy. The galaxy itself seemed to shiver as its most malevolent entities were forced to confront a power beyond their control, beyond their understanding, beyond annihilation. Reality itself bent toward the divine aurora. Oceans boiled and froze simultaneously under impossible gravitational distortions. Mountain ranges fractured into crystalline forms that reflected light in fractal infinity. Atmospheres ignited with golden fire, yet remained breathable, heat and radiation coexisting in contradiction. Time, too, seemed affected, flowing in irregular pulses as the sun god's presence imposed patterns upon events that mortals could neither predict nor resist. Prophets across countless worlds recorded visions that transcended prophecy, battles fought and won in moments, stars born and extinguished in heartbeats, empires rising and falling under the guidance of an authority that was absolute. Every being that perceived it, man, machine, or xenos, recognized their smallness, their fragility, their fleetingness, and yet were compelled to witness, to record, to honor. Even the emperor's throne felt diminished under the sun god's illumination. From the Sanctum Imperialis, whispers of recognition spread among the highest lords of Terra. Custodians paused mid-ritual, advisors and tech priests faltered, and the very golden energy of the throne's radiance seemed a candle beside a furnace. It was not a challenge to the emperor's authority, nor a denial of it. It was a presence beyond comparison, a cosmic truth that made the greatest of mankind's achievements appear insignificant. Within this illumination, loyalty, devotion, fear, and awe intertwined into a singular, overwhelming experience. The galaxy had encountered a force that required submission and understanding in equal measure, a divinity that demanded witness even as it reshaped existence itself. Across every frontier, from hive cities to frontier worlds, from shattered moons to orbital fortresses, the galaxy collectively paused. Soldiers, psychers, and citizens alike became part of the tapestry, woven into the resonance of a force that was judgment and blessing intertwined. Golden light etched itself into minds, hearts, and matter alike, imprinting an understanding that could neither be taught nor ignored. The rise of the sun god was not a moment to be resisted. It was a reality to be internalized, a truth burned into the cosmos itself. Mortals and immortals alike stood, paralyzed yet reverent, as the radiant authority transformed existence from mere survival into a theater of awe, comprehension, and unassailable power. And within this omnipresent radiance, a final, immutable fact emerged. The galaxy had witnessed the impossible. Nothing, living or constructed, could rival this power. Nothing could oppose it, and nothing could truly comprehend it. Yet in the impossibility lay understanding. All were witnesses, all were participants, all were bound to the rhythm and authority of a divinity that transcended reason, life, and death. The sun god had risen, and in his light the cosmos itself had bent, unresisting irrevocably toward awe, obedience, and revelation. And as the sun god ascended fully into the galaxy, silence followed, a silence not of peace, but of awe so profound it pressed upon every mind, every machine, and every sentient being with the weight of inevitability. Even the emperor's own throne, a seat that had commanded the devotion of 1,000,000 worlds, seemed dim beneath the radiance, a candle flickering before a furnace of creation. The golden light stretched across systems, bathing shattered moons, void fortresses, and hive cities alike, a presence that did not merely illuminate but redefine the cosmos itself. Every atom of space, every strand of warp energy, every heartbeat of life seemed to vibrate in response, acknowledging a dominion that no strategy, technology, or deity could contest. The custodians of Terra, immortal and vigilant, stood in stunned reverence as the throne's energy, once the apex of mortal achievement, flickered beside the sun god's incandescent aura. Even their augmented senses strained to comprehend the scale of divine authority now present. Haloed figures of light traced impossible arcs through the sky, their motion deliberate yet unknowable, a choreography written in the language of eternity. Servoskulls whirred silently, their recording instruments overwhelmed, while tech priests frantically attempted to document patterns that dissolved the very definitions of physics and logic. Each moment under this radiance was a lesson, a revelation, a reminder that the galaxy's hierarchy, for all its grandeur and cruelty, was but a fleeting shadow of something far greater. In the void, fleets hung suspended, motionless yet alive with the resonance of awe. Titans, ancient and colossal, paused mid-stride, their weapons melted or repurposed by radiant energy that refused to be resisted. Imperial starships drifted in orbit, hulls glowing as the light etched itself into every surface, marking them as witnesses to a new cosmic order. Xeno's fleets, whose arrogance had once seemed unshakable, now scattered or recoiled into the dark, unable to reconcile the sun god's presence with their own understanding of survival or supremacy. The warp itself bowed, its currents convulsing with obedience, the very threads of psychic energy bending toward the will of a power that transcended existence and negated opposition. On the surface of countless worlds, the effects were equally profound. Hive cities, built upon the labor of trillions over millennia, reflected and refracted the radiance in ways that transformed architecture into celestial art. Streets flowed with molten light, rivers glimmered with auric energy, and the skies above burned in infinite shades of gold and amber, collapsing the distinction between night and day. Citizens, soldiers, and psychers alike felt their hearts slow in reverent terror, as though the universe itself had taken a pause to witness a truth too immense for comprehension. Temples, shrines, and monuments flickered between reality and vision, their forms now channels of divine power that illuminated the spiritual and psychic planes alike. Each soul caught in the brilliance experienced a simultaneity of fear, devotion, and enlightenment, the awe of witnesses, the terror of those who understood their smallness, and the clarity of absolute order. Demons, lurking in the far reaches of the warp, found themselves wholly unable to escape or oppose the rising sun. Their forms dissolved under the purity of radiance, reduced to ephemeral motes of chaos that the golden light absorbed or scattered. Even the mightiest princes, whose centuries of carnage had made them unchallenged in the immaterium, recoiled at the realization that power could exist beyond corruption, beyond ambition, beyond their comprehension. Across the galaxy, the echoes of psychic screams faded, replaced by a silence heavier than death, punctuated only by the subtle hum of divine omnipotence. It was not judgment in the traditional sense. It was the affirmation of supremacy, the quiet declaration that all beings, all matter, all energy now existed under the gaze of an authority beyond measure. The golden radiance etched patterns into existence itself, as though reality were a canvas and the sun god its artist. Mountains shimmered and twisted, rivers burned with molten flow, and oceans reflected impossible geometries that seemed to move independently of planetary rotation. Atmospheric currents hummed with energy, carrying whispers of understanding that could not be spoken, only felt. Life, in all its diversity, paused and trembled, aware of its insignificance and simultaneously elevated by proximity to the divine. Even machine spirits, long devoid of sentiment beyond programming, emitted vibrations akin to awe, their mechanisms attuned to a frequency of reverence that no cogitator could predict. The galaxy, in every sector, bore witness to the transformation. All things were now instruments of comprehension, observation, and homage to a singular, radiant presence. From Terra to the distant fringe, psychers and astropaths recorded visions that defied linear thought. Stars born and died in moments. Empires rose and fell in heartbeats. Fleets were obliterated or transfigured as if part of a divine narrative written in molten gold. Those who could interpret the visions found themselves both terrified and enlightened, caught between the impossibility of resistance and the inevitability of submission. Even the most devout, who had spent their lives venerating the emperor, understood the futility of comparison. This was not another god, another threat, or another conqueror. This was a presence that dwarfed all else, an ultimate apex that rendered comprehension and obedience indistinguishable from awe and terror. And as the sun god reached the zenith of ascension, the galaxy seemed to collectively exhale. No fleet moved without his grace, no fortress resisted unscathed, no mind remained untouched. Silence, deep and absolute, settled over the cosmos, not tranquil, not gentle, but suffused with the gravity of cosmic judgment. Even the emperor himself, seated upon the throne of Terra, a paragon of mortal and divine unity, seemed reduced in scale, a single candle struggling against a furnace that could not be outshone. In that moment, all of creation, human, xenos, machine, and warp entity alike, understood the same immutable truth. The galaxy had encountered an authority that transcended rebellion, faith, and war. Submission was not a choice. Comprehension was not a privilege. Existence itself whispered allegiance, or faced annihilation under the inexorable gaze of radiance. The final impression left on the galaxy was clarity and inevitability. Every star, every planet, every vessel, and every mind bore witness to a presence that defined the limits of possibility. Time became secondary, history became relative, and space bent to the luminous authority of a God whose influence was both immediate and eternal. Nothing could resist, nothing could flee. Yet in this dominance there was a sublime order, a sense of cosmic rhythm that intertwined destruction with beauty, judgment with revelation, and awe with understanding. The sun god had risen, and in that act the galaxy had been forever transformed, not merely by light, but by the singular certainty that all creation now existed under the gaze of something eternal, unyielding, and gloriously absolute.